1342, Scotland. A church in the town of Howick. Sir Alexander Ramsay is holding court. He is the Sheriff of Roxburgh, one of the most respected knights in Scotland. A man who had recently recaptured the town of Roxburgh from the English in one of the most celebrated military actions of the year. He is by any measure at the height of his power and reputation. Armed men burst through the door. They are the men of William Douglas, the Knight of Liddesdale, the man who had held the sheriffdom of Roxburgh before Ramsay was appointed to it. The man who had been politically humiliated when Ramsay was given the position he believed was his. They drag Ramsay out of the church mid-session, in front of witnesses, in a place of sanctuary. None of it matters. He is bound, thrown on a horse, and ridden hard through the border country toward Liddesdale, toward Hermitage Castle. Douglas throws Ramsay into the pit beneath Hermitage Castle and walks away. No trial, no formal charge, no execution date, just a man in a hole in the ground, in the dark, with no food and no water. Ramsay does not die quickly. Above the pit, there is a granary. Through the cracks in the floor, tiny amounts of grain fall through. Not enough to live on, enough to keep dying slowly. Alexander Ramsay survives for 17 days in that pit, eating grain through the cracks, before he finally starves to death. Hermitage Castle sits in Liddesdale in the Scottish borders, a remote valley in Roxburghshire, close to what was once the most contested and violent stretch of the Anglo-Scottish frontier. The nearest village is miles away. The road that leads to it crosses open moorland. In poor weather, which is most of the year in Liddesdale, the drive-in feels like driving towards something that doesn't want to be reached. The castle itself is unlike almost anything else in Scotland. It is massive and severe, a great rectangular keep with towers projecting from each corner, the walls rising sheer from the boggy ground, almost no windows at lower levels. It doesn't look like a place where people lived. It looks like a place designed to contain something, or to hold people who weren't supposed to leave. Walter Scott visited Hermitage in the early 19th century and was sufficiently affected to write something that has stuck in every account of the castle since. He wrote that Hermitage was, in his view, unable to support the weight of iniquity accumulated within its walls and had therefore begun to sink into the ground. That last part is not entirely metaphorical. The castle does show signs of subsidence, the foundations settling into the soft, boggy earth of the valley. There is something about the castle, its isolation, its architecture, its history, that sits wrong in a way that is very hard to articulate to someone who hasn't stood in front of it on a grey borders afternoon. The castle was built in stages from the 13th century onward by a succession of families, the de Soulis, the Dacres, the Douglases, each of whom contributed to both the physical structure and the accumulating reputation. And each of them left something behind that the walls seem to have absorbed and kept. Hermitage Castle has been called the most evil place in Scotland by people who knew Scotland's violent history. The earliest and in some ways darkest chapter in Hermitage's history centres on the de Soulis family, the original lords of Hermitage, and specifically on William de Soulis, who held the castle in the early 14th century. The historical William de Soulis was a powerful Scottish nobleman who became involved in a conspiracy against Robert the Bruce. The Souls Conspiracy of 1320, which aimed to replace Bruce with Edward Balliol as King of Scotland. The conspiracy was discovered. De Soulis was arrested and died in Dumbarton Castle prison. That is the documented record. The legend of William de Soulis is considerably more dramatic. In border tradition, the folklore of the communities that lived in and around Liddesdale, de Soulis was a sorcerer, a practitioner of black magic, who had made a compact with a demonic familiar spirit called Robin Redcap. And the name tells you everything about the nature of this creature. Robin Redcap was a specific figure from border folklore, a goblin or demon that maintained the redness of its cap by dipping it in the blood of human victims. The cap had to be kept wet with fresh blood, or the creature would lose its power. De Soulis had bound this thing to himself through whatever dark ritual the legends describe, and in return it gave him protection. He could not be harmed by steel, he could not be bound by rope, he was invulnerable to the weapons of ordinary men. What de Soulis did with this protection, according to the legend, was use it to terrorize Liddesdale. He kidnapped local people, men, women, children, brought them to Hermitage Castle, and used them in occult rituals. The castle's dungeons were full of prisoners. The surrounding country lived in fear of him. And because he could not be harmed by conventional means, there was nothing anyone could do. Eventually, the local people petitioned Robert the Bruce himself, and Bruce, who had apparently received so many complaints about de Soli that he was thoroughly tired of the subject, reportedly responded with a phrase that he intended as dismissal and that the locals took as instruction. "Boil him if you must, but trouble me no further with him." They took him at his word. A group of locals seized de Solis and carried him to a prehistoric stone circle called the Nine-Stane Rig, which stands on the moor near Hermitage to this day. The stone circle was chosen deliberately. There was a tradition that certain rituals could only be performed within such places. Because de Solis could not be harmed by steel or rope, they wrapped him in lead sheeting, the one material the legend did not protect him against, and placed him in a great cauldron over a fire, and they boiled him alive. Again, the historical de Solis died in prison. The boiling is legend, not record. But the Nine-Stane Rig is real. It is still there on the moor, within sight of Hermitage, a real Bronze Age stone circle that has stood for 4,000 years. And the legend of Robin Redcap persisted in the area around Hermitage long after de Solis himself was forgotten. The creature associated not just with a specific lord, but with the castle itself, as if it had taken up permanent residence in the walls when its master was gone. Visitors to Hermitage today still occasionally report a sense of being watched from somewhere that isn't visible, a presence that isn't threatening exactly, but is deeply, instinctively wrong. Now let's go back to 1342 and the story I opened with, because Alexander Ramsay's death deserves its full telling. To understand why William Douglas did what he did, you need to understand the political landscape of the Scottish borders in the 1340s. The Anglo-Scottish Wars had been grinding on for decades. Land, titles, and positions of authority changed hands constantly depending on who held what territory. The sheriffdom of Roxburgh, the administrative authority over a crucial stretch of border territory, was a prize worth fighting for. Douglas, known as the Knight of Liddesdale, had held the position. He was a celebrated warrior, nicknamed the Flower of Chivalry for his military prowess. He considered the sheriffdom his by right of long service and military achievement. When Sir Alexander Ramsay captured Roxburgh Castle from the English in a daring operation in 1342, the king rewarded him with the sheriffdom. Douglas was passed over, publicly, visibly, irrevocably passed over in favor of a man who had just done something more impressive than Douglas had done in years. Douglas's response was not to petition the king or seek redress through legitimate channels. His response was to ride to Howick with armed men, drag Ramsay out of a church in the middle of a court session, and carry him to Hermitage. The pit at Hermitage was beneath the castle, a stone-lined dungeon accessible through a trapdoor. Above it, separated by the floor, was a granary. The grain stored above was imperfectly sealed. Small amounts fell through gaps in the floor into the pit below. Douglas left Ramsay there. He provided no food, no water, no light. He made no announcement of what he had done. He simply sealed the trapdoor and went about his business. Ramsay was not executed. He was not formally imprisoned. He was placed in a hole and forgotten, except that Ramsay did not die on schedule. The grain falling through the cracks above, tiny amounts, irregular, insufficient, was enough to extend life without making it survivable. Ramsay scratched and gathered whatever fell through. He ate it, and he waited for 17 days. 17 days in the dark, underground, in a Scottish border castle in summer, with no water and a few grains of corn through a crack in the ceiling. Ramsay died on or around the 17th day. The pit was eventually opened. The accounts do not specify when or why. His death became known. Douglas faced no immediate consequences. He faced them eventually, though, and the manner in which they came is one of those historical ironies that seems too perfect to be true, except that it is. William Douglas, the Knight of Liddesdale, the Flower of Chivalry, the man who had starved Alexander Ramsay to death in a pit, met his own end 11 years later in a way that reflects the border culture he inhabited perfectly. In 1353, Douglas was ambushed and killed while hunting in Ettrick Forest. The man who killed him was William Douglas, Earl of Douglas, his own godson, the same family, a younger man who had grown powerful enough to decide his godfather was inconvenient. The exact reasons for the killing are tangled in the political complexities of mid-14th century Scotland. The younger Douglas had political reasons, territorial reasons, personal reasons that the sources only partly illuminate. What is clear is that the Knight of Liddesdale, who had kidnapped a man from a church and left him to starve in a pit, was himself killed by someone he had trusted and helped raise. The irony is almost too neat, almost. But the Scottish borders in the 14th century was a place where violence created violence in chains. and Hermitage Castle sat at the center of the chain. Every act of brutality that happened within its walls or under its authority seemed to generate another and another in an unbroken sequence that ran through the decades. October 1566, Mary Queen of Scots is at Jedburgh, approximately 50 miles from Hermitage, presiding over a judicial circuit, the legal business of governing her kingdom. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, has been wounded in a skirmish on the border and is recovering at Hermitage Castle. Mary decides to visit him. To appreciate what this means, you need to understand the context. Bothwell was one of Mary's most loyal and capable supporters, a border lord with real military power in a kingdom full of unreliable nobles. He was also a man with a reputation, a complicated personal history, and a dynamic with the Queen that the court had been watching with interest. Mary was, at this point, still married to her second husband, Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, a marriage that had already deteriorated badly. She rode to Hermitage from Jedburgh and back in a single day, 50 miles each way, across open border moorland in October, cold, wet, with the ground already soft from autumn rains. The ride took approximately 10 hours each way. She spent a brief time at the castle, confirmed Bothwell was recovering, and turned back. On the return journey, her horse stumbled in a boggy stretch of ground. Mary fell. She was soaked, exhausted, and hypothermic. By the time she reached Jedburgh, within days, she was gravely ill. For a time, it was believed she would not survive. She did survive, but in the weeks of fever that followed, she is said to have murmured that she wished she had died. A remark that later biographers have connected to what came next. Within months, her husband Darnley was murdered in an explosion at Kirkhoe Field in Edinburgh. 3 months after that, Mary married Bothwell, the same man she had ridden 100 miles to visit in an autumn storm. The marriage destroyed her politically. Within a year, she had been forced to abdicate, imprisoned, and her son placed on the throne. Whether Bothwell was involved in Darnley's murder and Mary with him has been debated for 4.5 centuries without resolution. What is not debated is that the 100-mile ride to Hermitage Castle in October 1566 was one of the most consequential decisions Mary Queen of Scots ever made. Not because of what happened at the castle, but because of what her willingness to make that ride told the Scottish court about her relationship with Bothwell. You do not ride 100 miles across winter moorland to check on a subject, not unless it means something you cannot say in public. Hermitage Castle today is in the care of Historic Environment Scotland and is open to visitors. There is no village, no caff, no gift shop, just the castle and the valley and the River Hermitage running past it. People who visit Hermitage consistently report something they find difficult to describe. A heaviness, a sense that the air is different here than it is a mile away on the same road. Several paranormal investigators and researchers who have spent time at the castle describe it as one of the few locations in Britain where the atmosphere feels genuinely threatening rather than simply atmospheric. People report a presence that is not human in quality, not the ghost of someone who died here, but something that was never human to begin with. Something that has been here longer than the castle. Walter Scott's observation that the castle has sunk partly into the ground under the weight of its accumulated evil is visually true. The foundations are settling. The boggy ground is slowly reclaiming the base of the walls. Whether the castle is literally sinking or simply slowly being absorbed back into the landscape it was built on, the effect is the same. Hermitage Castle looks like a place that the earth is trying to take back, like the ground underneath it has decided that what was built here should eventually return to where it came from. William de Soulis, boiled alive in lead at a stone circle that is still standing on the moor. Alexander Ramsay, starved in a pit for 17 days while grain fell through the cracks. The Knight of Liddesdale, killed by his own godson in a forest. Mary Queen of Scots, riding 100 miles to a man she should not have been riding to and falling ill in a bog on the way back and setting in motion the chain of events that ended her reign. Hermitage Castle collected all of this. Every generation that held it added to the account, and the castle just kept standing in its valley, absorbing each new layer of violence, each new desperate act, each new decision made badly in a place that seemed to bring out the worst in everyone who came near it. Walter Scott said it was sinking under the weight of its iniquity. He meant it as a kind of dark poetry, but standing in front of it on the right day, in the right weather, with the right quality of border light. It doesn't feel like poetry.